Random House Audio and Recorded Books present A Widow for 1 Year by John Irving. Read for you by George Guidall.
To Janet, a love story. As for this little lady, the best thing I can wish her is a little misfortune. Thackeray. Part 1. Summer 1958. The Inadequate Lampshade. One night, when she was 4 and sleeping in the bottom bunk of her bunk bed, Ruth Cole woke to the sound of lovemaking. It was coming from her parents' bedroom. It was a totally unfamiliar sound to her. Ruth had recently been ill with a stomach flu. When she first heard her mother making love, Ruth thought that her mother was throwing up. It was not as simple a matter as her parents having separate bedrooms. That summer they had separate houses, although Ruth never saw the other house. Her parents spent alternate nights in the family house with Ruth. There was a rental house nearby, where Ruth's mother or father stayed when they weren't staying with Ruth. It was one of those ridiculous arrangements that couples make when they are separating, but before they are divorced, when they still imagine that children and property can be shared with more magnanimity than recrimination. When Ruth woke to the foreign sound, she at first wasn't sure if it was her mother or her father who was throwing up. Then, despite the unfamiliarity of the disturbance, Ruth recognized that measure of melancholy and contained hysteria which was often detectable in her mother's voice. Ruth also remembered that it was her mother's turn to stay with her. The master bathroom separated Ruth's room from the master bedroom. When the 4-year-old padded barefoot through the bathroom, she took a towel with her. When she'd been sick with the stomach flu, her father had encouraged her to vomit in a towel. Poor Mommy, Ruth thought, bringing her a towel. In the dim moonlight, and in the even dimmer and erratic light from the night light that Ruth's father had installed in the bathroom, Ruth saw the pale faces of her dead brothers in the photographs on the bathroom wall. There were photos of her dead brothers throughout the house, on all the walls. Although the 2 boys had died as teenagers, before Ruth was born, before she was even conceived, Ruth felt that she knew these vanished young men far better than she knew her mother or father. The tall, dark one with the angular face was Thomas. Even at Ruth's age, when he'd been only 4, Thomas had had a leading man's kind of handsomeness. A combination of poise and thuggery that, in his teenage years, gave him the seeming confidence of a much older man. Thomas had been the driver of the doomed car. The younger, insecure-looking one was Timothy. Even as a teenager, he was baby-faced and appeared to have just been startled by something. In many of the photographs, Timothy seemed to be caught in a moment of indecision, as if he were perpetually reluctant to imitate an incredibly difficult stunt that Thomas had mastered with apparent ease. In the end, it was something as basic as driving a car that Thomas failed to master sufficiently. When Ruth Cole entered her parents' bedroom, she saw the naked young man who had mounted her mother from behind. He was holding her mother's breasts in his hands and humping her on all 4s, like a dog. But it was neither the violence nor the repugnance of the sexual act that caused Ruth to scream. The 4-year-old didn't know that she was witnessing a sexual act, nor did the young man's and her mother's activity strike Ruth as entirely unpleasant. In fact, Ruth was relieved to see that her mother was not throwing up. And it wasn't the young man's nakedness that caused Ruth to scream. She had seen her father and her mother naked. Nakedness was not hidden among the Coles. It was the young man himself who made Ruth scream, because she was certain he was one of her dead brothers. He looked so much like Thomas, the confident one, that Ruth Cole believed she had seen a ghost. A 4-year-old's scream is a piercing sound. Ruth was astonished at the speed with which her mother's young lover dismounted. Indeed, he removed himself from both the woman and her bed with such a combination of panic and zeal that he appeared to be propelled. It was almost as if a cannonball or an object of equal force had dislodged him. He fell over the night table and, in an effort to conceal his nakedness, removed the lampshade from the broken bedside lamp. As such, he seemed a less menacing sort of ghost than Ruth had first judged him to be. Furthermore, now that Ruth took a closer look at him, she recognized him. He was the boy who occupied the most distant guest room, the boy who drove her father's car, the boy who worked for her daddy, her mommy had said. Once or twice the boy had driven Ruth and her babysitter to the beach. That summer, Ruth had 3 different nannies. Each of them had commented on how pale the boy was. But Ruth's mother had told her that some people just didn't like the sun. The child had never before seen the boy without his clothes, of course. Yet Ruth was certain that the young man's name was Eddie, and that he wasn't a ghost. Nevertheless, the 4-year-old screamed again. Her mother, still on all fours on her bed, looked characteristically unsurprised. She merely viewed her daughter with an expression of discouragement that was edged with despair. Before Ruth could cry out a 3rd time, her mother said, "Don't scream, honey. It's just Eddie and me. Go back to bed." Ruth Cole did as she was told, once more passing those photographs, more ghostly seeming now than her mother's fallen ghost of a lover. Eddie, while attempting to hide himself with the lampshade, had been oblivious to the fact that the lampshade, being open at both ends, afforded Ruth an unobstructed view of his diminishing penis. At 4, Ruth was too young to ever remember Eddie or his penis with the greatest detail. But he would remember her. 36 years later, when he was 52 and Ruth was 40, this ill-fated young man would fall in love with Ruth Cole. Yet not even then would he regret having fucked Ruth's mother. Alas, that would be Eddie's problem. This is Ruth's story. That her parents had expected her to be a 3rd son was not the reason Ruth Cole became a writer. A more likely source of her imagination was that she grew up in a house where the photographs of her dead brothers were a stronger presence than any presence she detected in either her mother or father. And that after her mother abandoned her and her father, and took with her almost all the photos of her lost sons, Ruth would wonder why her father left the picture hooks stuck in the bare walls. The picture hooks were part of the reason she became a writer, because, for years after her mother left, Ruth would try to remember which of the photographs had hung from which of the hooks. And, failing to recall the actual pictures of her perished brothers to her satisfaction, Ruth began to invent all the captured moments in their short lives, which she had missed. That Thomas and Timothy were killed before she was born was another part of the reason Ruth Cole became a writer. From her earliest memory, she was forced to imagine them. It was one of those automobile accidents involving teenagers that, in the aftermath, revealed that both boys had been good kids, and that neither of them had been drinking. Worst of all, to the endless torment of their parents, the coincidence of Thomas and Timothy being in the front seat of that car at that exact time, and in that specific place, was the result of an altogether avoidable quarrel between the boy's mother and father. The poor parents would relive the tragic results of their trivial argument for the rest of their lives. Later,
Sample complete. Ready to continue?